Welcome back to Legacy Battle. We have a unique show for you here today on the life of Shoeless Joe Jackson, the biggest scandal in sports history, and a little bit about the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum, Baseball and Library in South Carolina. We're going to welcome from the Shoeless Joe Jackson Museum, Tom Blaha. Did I say your last name right, Tom?
Yes, you did.
Fantastic. So he is here to share an incredible story, and we're going to have a bunch of questions for him, and we'll talk about the museum at the end as well. So thank you for coming on, Tom.
Okay, I'm glad to be here.
And our panelists tonight, Brian King from the Gridiron Battle Zone and from the Canadian Baseball Hall of Fame, Scott Crawford. And before we start in our Q&A, Brian's just going to give us a little synopsis here of Shoeless Joe.
So yeah, we'll get into the life of and career of Shoeless Joe Jackson with Tom in a moment. But first, for those of you not familiar with the biggest story of his life, please allow me to give everyone a brief overview on the Black Sox scandal. The Chicago White Sox were owned by Charlie Comiskey, and he had a reputation for underpaying his players and making moves to keep players from reaching their bonuses. This created a lot of tension in the locker room. In 1919, a member of the White Sox was approached by a bookmaker and was convinced to throw or purposely lose the upcoming World Series in exchange for money. Later, 7 more players joined the conspiracy, including Joe Jackson. While the other players did their best to make crucial mistakes, ensuring the club's losses, Jackson played very well, almost as if he didn't realize what he was supposed to be doing. After discovering the conspiracy and a lengthy trial, Major League Baseball banned all 8 men, including Jackson, from its league for life.
All right, Tom, 13 years old. Joe's playing for the Brandon Mills baseball team. What can you tell us about his young career there that included Saturday specials and Blue Darters?
Well, he actually started working for the Brandon Mill at the age of 6. One of the things that we find people that come to the museum that know about him in advance is that his nickname was Shoeless, and we can talk about that in a little while about how he hated it, but also that he was illiterate. And the reason he was illiterate was that he never went to school because he started working at the Brandon Mill at the age of 6. Now, these textile mills were the major employer in this part of both of the Carolinas, really what we call upstate South Carolina, because we had the waterfalls here that the mills harnessed the power from. And Joe's family were tenant farmers in Pickens County, which is the next county west of Greenville, out toward Clemson. And the dad got the idea in the 1890s they would move into Greenville and get jobs in the textile mill, including young Joe, who was 6 years old. Now, you might wonder, what does a 6-year-old do in a mechanized factory? One of the things we've got in our museum is a little wicker woven chair, a little kid-sized chair that not Joe himself, but somebody like Joe, it would have been a type chair that he would have had, that would sit in this mill. And whenever any of the machinery broke down, the foreman would blow the whistle, all the machinery would stop, because the machinery was packed together so tight that a grown adult couldn't fit in there to fix it. So the little kid would get up and they'd give him a wrench or a screwdriver and he'd get in there and fix it. And that's how Joe Jackson started working in the textile mill at the age of 6. Obviously, as he got older, they assigned other tasks to him within the mill. And these people worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week. And the mill owners came up with the idea that on their people's day off, they would give them something to do for a diversion, but it would also, from the mill owner standpoint, generate loyalty towards the mill, because everybody wanted to work for the mill that had the best baseball team. So I took a circuitous route to get back to your original question. Joe started playing for the Brandon Mill baseball team at the age of 13, alongside grown men. And by the time he was 15, he was the best player, not only on the Brandon Mill team, but on any of the Mill teams. He literally was a legend in the upstate at the age of 15, kind of comparable to, you hear these stories about the basketball phenoms today on the playgrounds of Harlem, and everybody, including Nike, knows who they are when they're 15. Well, there wasn't any Nike back then, and certainly wasn't any television. But Joe Jackson literally became a legend at the age of 15. And you asked about the Blue Darters. That was he had a very good batting eye, and he used to hit some really hard line drives. And Blue Darters was the nickname that they gave to the line drives that he had. And like I said, he was playing against and dominating grown men by the age of 15. He started playing at 13 in the textile mill leagues, and that's where he got to from then. So, and if you want to, I can lead into by the time he progressed through the mills. The the pay for the full grown adult at the mill was $55 a month. And if you were on the baseball team, you got $65 a month. Presumably they passed the hat around at these games and collected money as well. Anyway, Joe played for the Brandon Mill team, continued to work at Brandon Mill. And by the time he was in his late teens or early 20s, he started playing semi-pro ball. And this is where we get to the part. And again, I'm building off of your question here. I know this is going to be edited, so that'll be fine. To get to the point where the nickname Shoeless came from. By the time he was 21 or 20, he was playing for a local semi-pro team called the Greenville Spinners. They weren't affiliated with the mill, but obviously they took their nickname from the major economic activity of the area, the Greenville Spinners. And they were playing a game against Anderson, South Carolina, which is a sort of a neighboring town here called the Anderson Electricians. And Joe knew the pro scouts were watching him by this time. He was 21 years old, and he knew the pro scouts were watching him, and he wanted to look as good and as professional as he could. He bought himself a brand new pair of the most expensive baseball shoes, cleats that he could find. And in this game, he hadn't broken them in yet. And in this game, about the third or fourth inning, these shoes were absolutely killing him. So during the half inning, when his team is into bat, he figures, well, my turn to bat's not going to come up. I'll just take these shoes off and rest my feet for a couple of minutes till it's time to go back out into the field. So he did that, and they made the third out, and it was time to go back out into the field, and he couldn't get the shoes back on. So he went out and played center field in his stocking feet, and nobody noticed because it's like 300 odd feet out there in center field. But the next half inning, when they come in, it is his turn to bat, and he still can't get the shoes on. So he goes up to bat in his stocking feet, and he hit an inside the park home run, pushing in front of him what turned out to be the winning runs of the game. And as he's rounding third base, one of the opposing fans called him a shoeless SOB. And a newspaper writer heard that, thought it was cute, cleaned it up for publication. This is 1908, of course. So the heading in the paper the next day, in the summary of that game the next day, was Shoeless Jackson defeats Anderson 8-6, or whatever the score was. So it was an accurate adjective describing his condition on that particular event on that particular day, but it ended up being a nickname that stuck with him for the rest of his life. And he absolutely hated that nickname. When he got up north and started playing in the major leagues, that nickname followed him up there, and he hated it because it contributed to the image that all those Yankees up there had of him being a backwoods redneck that never wore shoes. So in the museum, when we do the tour, I always tell that story next to a photograph that we've got, a portrait photograph, studio photograph of Joe from when he was big time. He was at the height of his career. He was probably the third or fourth highest paid player in the majors, and he was always trying to live down this nickname Shoeless in front of those Yankees up north. So he always wore the most expensive suits, the most expensive shoes, and drove the most expensive cars, usually a Cadillac or a Packard, because he was always trying to live down that nickname. So I wanted to get that in there, and it built off your question about him starting to play for the Mill team at 13.
Right. Good, Scott.
All right. In August 1915, there was, of course, a big trade. I believe 21st of August. It seems like he was having one of his best years with Cleveland through half the season, and the trade seems kind of lopsided to me. I mean, there was a lot of cash that dealt, but and only a couple players. Like, why did that trade happen, and why did it seem so lopsided at the time? Because you're giving the best player in baseball away for some money and a few other guys.
Well, my understanding of it is, and we've skipping ahead to 1915, you deprived me of my opportunity to be a Cleveland chauvinist. I'm a Cleveland native and born and raised in Cleveland, and with all the baggage that takes with it from over the years. So I always like to point out about him batting .408 in 1911 as a rookie with Cleveland. But I'm assuming we're going to get back to that. But to answer your question directly, Scott, my understanding of it is that the Cleveland team had some financial difficulties in 1915, and the key part of it in terms of rationalizing it, per your question, was the cash part of it. I don't have the figures in front of me. I'm not sure that the cash was that huge, but the way that I always understood it and had it explained to me was that Cleveland needed to unload him because of some cash issues, either for whatever cash they made in the transaction or for whatever cash they were saving by dumping his salary. That's the explanation that I've gotten.
Yeah, it looked like according to Baseball Reference, it was $31,500 that they got. So I mean, that was obviously big money. I'm not sure what he was making back then, but he would have been making several thousand. But
He was
Just
probably
starts.
making five. He was probably making 5 or 6 thousand a year. Ty Cobb was probably the highest paid player in the American League, and he wasn't making probably much more than that, maybe 7,000. Nobody was making 5 digits. So yeah, 31,000 would have been a pretty good chunk of money.
Yep.
So
Brian,
that's my understanding why the trade took place.
since he kind of answered your first question here, you want to ask about the early Cleveland days, and that'll get that in.
Absolutely, yeah. Okay, so Tom, what was Shoeless Joe Jackson like in the early Cleveland days?
Well, again, I've already confessed to being a Cleveland chauvinist here, so I like to talk about all the things that were positive for him in Cleveland. But to fully understand that, you've got to look back a little bit earlier. He actually made his major league debut with the Philadelphia Athletics in 1908. It was that same season that I told you the story about him getting the nickname Shoeless. He turned 21 in 1908, and he married a local girl named Katie Wynn. She was a Milltown kid also, and she was 15 when they got married. He was 21 and she was 15. They stayed married over 40 years. They never had any kids. But at the end of that semi-pro season in 1908, the Philadelphia Athletics had a scout watching them. So that story about the new pair of baseball spikes so that he'd look professional for the scouts was spot on, because the Philadelphia A's, which were probably the wealthiest team in baseball at that point. This was well before the New York Yankees got to be the financial behemoth that they are now. In fact, the Yankees were second fiddle even in New York City to the Giants. But the Philadelphia A's were definitely the dominant team financially in the American League. And they had a scout down there watching Joe. They signed him to a pro contract when his semi-pro season ended in 1908. And they brought him up to Philadelphia for 5 games at the end of the 1908 season to see how he'd fit in. And the answer was not very well. Connie Mack was the owner of the Philadelphia A's and also the manager. In fact, he was the manager of the Philadelphia A's into the early 50s. When I first started collecting baseball cards as a little kid in the early 50s, he was still the manager of the Philadelphia A's since he was the time before my dad was even born, because he was also the owner of the club, and you don't fire yourself, I guess. Anyway, I digress. They brought Joe Jackson up to Philadelphia 2 weeks after he got married. He had just turned 21, and they weren't going to pay to send his 15-year-old bride up there. So he's up there for a 5-game cup of coffee to see how he'll fit in, and it was a disaster. He'd never been out of the South before. He'd never been in a big city before. 1908, there's still people alive that had fought in the Civil War, and obviously most of them in Philadelphia were, on the other side. So he took a little bit of abuse from fans, from the opposing team, and even from his own team. Most of Connie Mack's players on the Philadelphia A's were college men, and Joe hadn't even been to elementary school. So even on his own team, even the teammates that were nice to him, he didn't even really understand what they were talking about half the time, because they used sort of different vocabulary than he did. So he didn't fit in real well. And Connie Mack was a shrewd baseball man and a shrewd businessman, and he could see that. So he signed Joe for 1909 and let him play the full season in 1909 in Savannah with the Savannah club. And Joe's talent level was so high above that league, it was pathetic. He won the league batting title by a lot. He took Savannah to the league championship. So they brought him up to Philadelphia for 5 games again at the end of the 1909 season, and it was disastrous again. He went AWOL from practice one day, and they sent the private detective out to look for him, and they found him down the train station trying to buy a train ticket back to Greenville so he could get back to Kate. So Connie Mack, good baseball man, good businessman. He's thinking, this is the last straw. I know this guy's got talent, but I'm tired of messing with him, so I got to get something out of it. So he trades him to Cleveland in 1910. Now, as it turns out, the Cleveland team at that time was owned by a guy called Charles Summers, who also coincidentally owned a minor league team in New Orleans. And Charles Summers had been taking notes on Joe's relatively slow transition from being a small town Southern boy to being a big city major leaguer, and saw how slow that transition was taking place and how it was maybe being mishandled a little bit in Philadelphia. So Summers, like I said, coincidentally, besides owning the Cleveland baseball team in the American League, also owned a minor league team in New Orleans, and he let Joe start the 1910 season in New Orleans. And Joe did extremely well, playing in the Southern Association for the New Orleans Pelicans. So well that Summers brought him up to Cleveland at the end of the 1910 season for 20 games. Okay, now this time he's been married for 2 years rather than 2 weeks. He's coming up for 20 games rather than 5, so he gets to bring Katie with him. And Katie and Joe rented a house that was like 2 blocks away from the stadium that the Cleveland team played in. League Park was the name of it, at East 65th in Lexington. So in those days, they played all day games because they didn't have floodlights. And Katie would go to the games about the 7th inning. She'd get up and walk home and make him a nice Southern dinner. And he'd walk home sometimes with his uniform still on, 2 blocks away with little kids tugging at him and everything. The point is, he and Katie fit in well in Cleveland. They didn't have any kids, but they were involved in all kinds of philanthropic stuff. They were asked to do things like be Grand Marshal of the Easter Parade and that kind of stuff. And Joe fit in better with his teammates in Cleveland. They weren't Ivy Leaguers like Connie Mack had. They were mostly country boys. So it was a good fit. Such a good fit. And here's the direct answer to your question. Such a good fit that 1911, the following season, was the first year that he actually broke camp with the big league club and went north. So they didn't have such a thing as a Rookie of the Year award back then, but the standards that we use to determine whether or not you're eligible for a Rookie of the Year award these days is a certain number of major league at bats in previous seasons. Remember, he'd only had 5 games in Philadelphia in 08, 5 games in Philadelphia in 09, 20 games in Cleveland in 1910. So under our parameters that we use today to determine a rookie status, he would have been considered a rookie in 1911. He played the whole season for Cleveland in 1911 as a rookie, batted .408 over the whole season. Now, again, you guys are baseball savvy. When I'm explaining this to people at the museum, I have to explain to them nobody bats .400. The last guy to bat .400 over a full season was Ted Williams in 1941, and that was before I was born, and I'm old. So anyway, Joe Jackson bats .408 in a full season 1911 in Cleveland as a rookie. Didn't win the batting title, though, because he had the misfortune of playing in the same league at the same time as his neighbor, Mr. Tyrus Raymond Cobb from over in Royston, Georgia, which is only about 80 miles west here. And they've got a museum there also. In fact, their museum staff plays a challenge match of vintage baseball against our museum staff every year. One year we host them at the Joe Jackson Diamond, which is right next to the Brandon Mill where Joe used to play and work. It's not a textile mill anymore. Those jobs have all moved out for the same reason they moved down here from New England to begin with. That is cheaper labor. But anyway, I'll get to that later. Where was I going with that? Got myself tied in the knot there. Oh yeah. So 1911, I was talking about the Ty Cobb Museum. Yeah, Ty Cobb Museum. We play a vintage game against them every other. We host it one year, they hosted another year. Back to Joe Jackson though. Batted .408 in 1911, didn't win the league batting title, but .408 is pretty significant for a full season. 1912, 1913, he continues. He's gone from overnight from the redneck that didn't fit in Philadelphia to literally a superstar in Cleveland. Not just a local celebrity, but a national celebrity. He was either number 1 or number 2 in every offensive category from 1911 really through 1920 when he quit playing. And those that he was second to Ty Cobb. Joe's lifetime average is 356. That's a very significant number. We've got it in all of our merch. I've got it on the back of the shirt that I'm wearing here. We got permission from the city of Greenville and the post office for the address of our museum to be 356. All the clocks in our museum are stopped at 4 minutes to 4, which is 356. The importance of that, 20,000 guys have played Major League Baseball since it started in 1876, and only 2 of them have a higher lifetime batting average than Joe Jackson, and that's Ty Cobb and Rogers Hornsby. So Joe's lifetime average of 356. Anyway, he became a national superstar, and so much so to the fact that one of the things I learned since I've been working as a volunteer docent at the museum and recently got promoted to be a board member as well. One of the things we have in the museum is a baseball library, and that baseball library is there because it was donated by the widow of Gene Carney. Gene Carney was a baseball researcher who was largely responsible for the research of interest in Joe Jackson that spawned all of the books and movies of the early 1980s, The Field of Dreams, 8 Men Out. A lot of that was spawned by the research and the interest that Gene Carney's research brought back into the public eye, and those novelists and screenwriters and everything ran with it. When Gene died, his wife gave his library to us. And since I've been working at the museum, I knew a lot of this stuff to begin with because I'm a lifetime baseball fan, former Sabre member, lifetime historian. But I've learned something every time because every time I go there to work, I take one of those books from the library, take it home and read it. One of the things that I found in that, and this is important, I think, in the pre-television age, Joe Jackson became such a star in Cleveland that he had what I call from our time period, the Michael Jordan effect. In other words, if you were a baseball fan and you lived in a town with a crappy American League team like St. Louis or Washington, and you could only afford to go to one game a year, you went when Cleveland was in town because you wanted to see Joe Jackson play. And I remember that being the case with the NBA fans in cities that didn't have very good teams. If you could only get to one game a year, you went when Chicago Bulls were in town because you wanted to see Michael Jordan. And it was almost, in the one book that I read stated, almost that way. He was literally that kind of a star. And again, this is pre-television age, so it's the point where if people in other towns are saving their money to come out and see you, when you're there to play against their hometown team, you're literally a national superstar. And he was. He and Ty Cobb were number one or number two in every offensive category through all those years. So he was a dominant player with Cleveland. He fit in quite well with Nap Lajoie's team. Nap Lajoie was the manager of the team. In fact, they were called the Cleveland Naps. The first year they took on the moniker Cleveland Indians was 1915. That was Joe's last year with them. He left in season that year. So anyway, he got traded to Chicago for reasons that we've already talked about. And then I'm assuming that some of the questions we're going to come up with later are going to be talking about his performance in the 1919 World Series and how we could maybe argue that he wasn't in on the fix, or at least didn't cooperate with it. So I'll pause for a minute here and see where we're going with the agenda. I know you asked for a drink of water and I knocked you down with a fire hose, but okay.
No, that's perfect. And it's a great segue because actually that is our next question. We're going to jump into the 1919 World Series here.
Okay.
Tell us about his performance on the field in that World Series. And then I know our further questions will get into a little bit more of, the scandalous part of it. But what was his performance like on the field for that World Series?
Well, his batting average for that World Series was .375, and it was the highest average of anybody on either team. So that's a pretty good argument right there that if he was trying to throw the World Series, he must not have got the memo. His batting average was .375, which was the highest of anybody on either team. He had 12 hits, which was not only the highest number of hits of anybody on either team in that World Series, but the highest number of hits in anybody on either team for probably the next 45 World Series. I think that record was eventually tied or broken maybe by fellow South Carolinian Bobby Richardson with the Yankees in the early 60s. I'm not 100% certain of that, but it doesn't matter who broke it and when, but it was 12 hits in the World Series was a record that stood for over 40 years. The one that strikes me the most significant, besides those offensive stats, though, he actually threw a guy out at home plate from his position in right field. Now, if you think about it, if you're in on the fix and you're trying to lose on purpose, one of the things you could probably get away with not doing and not have it really be recognized is not throwing a guy out at home plate. I mean, you could throw to the cutoff man instead. And but if you take the initiative to make the effort to throw the guy out at home plate, that's pretty hard to argue that you're on the fix. So I see those kinds of things, his performance both offensively and defensively, as mitigating against him being in on the fix. Now the question always is, well, did he take the money? And who knows for sure because nobody was there. It was represented, I think, in the movie 8 Men Out. That Lefty Williams passed the money along to him. We do know that it was two pitchers that were dealing directly with the gamblers. It was Eddie Seacott, and maybe I'm getting into your next question here, but natural segue, I guess. Eddie Seacott and Lefty Williams were the two pitchers. And if you think about it, if you're trying to rig a World Series or any kind of baseball game, a pitcher's probably the best guy to deal with. So they were the ones that were dealing directly with the gamblers. And the gamblers told him that, we got to know that your best guy is in on this, because if we can, bribe you pitchers all that we want, and you guys can groove balls to the Cincinnati Reds all that you want, but if your best guy ain't in on it, you guys could end up winning, by mistake. And we got millions invested in this. We got to make sure your best guy's in on it. So the story that I understand is that Lefty Williams was Joe's roommate on the road, and they gave Lefty $5,000 to give Joe, which was pretty close to a year's salary at that point. And he put it on Joe's pillow, and Joe said, "What's this?" And he said, "That's your money for blowing the World Series." He said, "I'm not blowing the World Series. Take the money back." He said, "I'm not taking the money back. What do I do with it?" "I don't know. Leave it here for the hotel maid." Well, a guy that grew up in a mill town, living in company housing, wasn't going to leave $5,000 laying around. So the way I understand it, he hung on to the money. One explanation that I've read that I choose to believe is that he put the money in a trust fund so that he could always show that a statement that he never touched a dime of it, and it sat that way for probably 20 years. Katie's sister was terminally ill and eventually came to live with him in the house that our museum is in right now, and he finally dipped into that money and like 1941 to help pay some of her medical bills. And then when she passed away, he donated whatever was left of it to the cancer fund or whatever charity of whatever it was she died of. That's my understanding on how that went. And again, maybe I got ahead of myself on that, but that's part of the spiel that I give at the museum, and it all just comes out naturally.
Yeah. So anyway, that kind of dips into my next question a little bit, but I was going to say, you mentioned it yourself, and and by some accounts that Joe was maybe illiterate or didn't have much education at all.
Yeah.
That's most likely a true description of him. And then so in your view, does this make his involvement with the fix it conspiracy less intentional, or a little more like maybe his gullibility was being taken advantage of?
Yeah, I think so. I think not only was his gullibility being taken advantage of, but I think once they got to the point where they went to court, and there's no law against losing games on purpose, but there are fraud laws, and he and the other 7 teammates did go to court in the state of Illinois under conspiracy to commit fraud. And he didn't even know that he should have a lawyer when he went to court. Comiskey offered him a lawyer, but it was the club's lawyer. That lawyer's job was to protect the interests of the club rather than to protect some illiterate redneck from South Carolina. And Joe had no clue. I mean, to him, a lawyer was a lawyer, and boy, he was thankful Mr. Comiskey provided him with a lawyer. So that always struck me as kind of a conflict of interest. So yeah, I think he was. I think in that respect, he was very unsophisticated and very passive.
All right, I got a question about Joe near the end of his career there, Tom. As of 1920, he played 13 years in the big leagues, had over 1,300 games. He was 32 years old, but 1920 was his best season since 1912. Was he getting better? I mean, not many players get better when they hit their early to mid 30s. They generally tail off, but that was his best season in 8 years. What made him different? Was he getting better? Was he just having a super year and going to tail off, you think, in a couple of years? What do you think?
I don't know that there's a direct or an absolute answer to that question. Obviously, his stats had gotten better since his early days in Cleveland. But I don't know. I don't know a specific answer to that. But it's interesting that enough, and here again is my Cleveland chauvinism coming out. Cleveland is who won the American League in 1920 and went on to beat the Dodgers in the World Series. And, it was one of these if only sorts of things. Like the Red Sox fans always say, if only Babe Ruth had stayed with the Red Sox. Maybe the Cleveland fans saying, if only he'd stayed with Cleveland, he'd have been there in that World Series in 1920. He did win a World Series. This often gets overlooked. He did win a World Series with the White Sox in 1917 against John McGraw's Giants. And that's one of the things that I often point out at the museum. So no, I don't have a direct answer to your question, Scott, on that one in terms of trend. It would seem to make sense, as you said, that as he got older, that he would be tapering off a little bit. Maybe his eye was getting better. Maybe he was, learning the pitchers better. I don't know what the explanation, but it is ironic, isn't it? That being his last year when pretty much everything was taken away from him and that he was on the upswing again statistically.
So there were always rumors of Joe, after being banned by MLB, changing his name and playing in other baseball leagues. We also see this at the ending of the film 8 Men Out. What can you tell us about this story? Is this true or legend?
The part about the change in the name might be legend, but I do know that he did play under his own name for a lot of independent teams. Now, he was banned from organized baseball, which means the major leagues as well as affiliated minor leagues. But all of these small towns in the South had their own sort of independent town teams that weren't affiliated with Major League Baseball, or if they were in leagues, they were self-contained local leagues. Now, you got to keep in mind, this is before television. A lot of these small towns in the South didn't even have cinemas. So the thing that you did on the weekend, on Friday night or Saturday, was you went to the town team ball game, and they pass the hat around and collect maybe $8 or $9 worth of nickels and quarters and divide it up among the players. So did they get paid? Yes. Was it enough to live off of? No, that's why it was called semi-professional. And the reason I'm saying that is that we have a number of newspaper clippings on display in our museum showing Shoeless Joe Jackson guesting for the Waycross, Georgia team, or guesting for the various these independent teams that I was talking about. So he was playing for those teams under his own name because his name was attractive to their fans. So these teams that I was saying would pass the hat on our normal night and collect $8 or $9 worth of nickels and quarters. If Joe Jackson was making a guest appearance, and you passed the hat around, you had a lot more people there. Maybe you'd collect 40 or $50 worth of nickels and quarters instead of $8 or $9. Of course, you had to give half of it to him. That's why he was there. But and we've got a series of clippings that actually document that, all of them with his name, Joe Jackson, on it, because that's where the value was from Joe Jackson. I don't know that he played somewhere under an assumed name. I've heard that as well. As far as I know, that's legend, because I haven't seen any any demonstration or proof of it. It is the kind of furtive thing that, though, that you would think that anybody could prove it wouldn't want to have proved it historically. But we've got these clippings showing him making guest appearances with some of these local teams all the way as far north as New Jersey. Now, the other thing I want to address, and a lot of people that come to the museum somehow think that after he got banned from baseball, he lived a life of destitute poverty. Joe and Katie were always pretty well off, for a couple of kids that came from a mill town and, sort of grew up in company housing. When Joe got banned from baseball in 1920, he and Katie went back to Savannah. That one season they played in Savannah, they'd opened a dry cleaning shop there that grew into what was back in the day known as a valet service. They had like 20 employees, and that's where he used to go in the off seasons anyway, after 1909. So he actually went back there full time from 1920 to 1931. They lived in Savannah. In 1931, Joe's mom became terminally ill, and they moved back to Greenville. And here's why I bring up the fact that they didn't live in poverty. 1933, when Prohibition ended, Joe got in on the ground floor and got a liquor store. And we've got the doors from that liquor store in our museum. So when people come in, I tell them, touch that doorknob. You're touching something that was touched by Joe Jackson and Ty Cobb, because there's a story about Ty Cobb after Joe was banned from baseball. And Royston, Georgia is only 80 miles from here. Ty Cobb came in there one day and did his liquor shopping, and didn't say a word to Joe, and he's cashing out. And Joe said, "Don't you recognize me, Ty?" And Ty said, "Yeah." Ty said, "Don't you recognize me, Joe?" And Joe said, "Yeah, I recognize you, but I wasn't sure you wanted to recognize me." So he did have a little bit of a hang up about the fact that that baseball had put that mark on him. But anyway, he did very well with that liquor store. And Joe and Katie never had any kids, but they had this house that our museum is in, is a brick bungalow. They had it built from scratch out near the Brandon Mill area where they both came from. Because that's where all their friends and where all their relatives were. So, the gap between pro athletes and regular people was nowhere near as wide back then as it is now. But it was still pretty wide when you think of a couple of kids that, grew up in a mill town and company housing, and they go back and they have a house built from scratch right back there in their old home turf. Not that they were lording it over people, quite the opposite. They were quite philanthropic. There's all kinds of stories, about Joe teaching young kids how to bat, and about the neighbor girl that couldn't go to the prom because she couldn't afford the prom dress, and Joe having Katie take her downtown and buy her the prom dress. So with that liquor store, they were fairly well off. And they lived a fairly comfortable life. He actually died in the house. One of the things that I point out in there is that he died in the front bedroom, and that his casket was actually displayed in the living room of the house rather than in a funeral home. And they couldn't fit it in through the door, so they had to take out the main window. And like a lot of times when I'm taking people through on the tour, somebody will be standing right there. I'll say, "Joe Jackson's casket was right there where you're standing when it was displayed." He passed away in December of 1951 at the age of what had been 63. Yeah, 63. So I probably got off on a tangent again. Sorry.
But Tom, Shoeless Joe, he's played by a couple of actors and a couple of great baseball movies. D.B. Sweeney in Eight Men Out, and by the late great Ray Liotta in Field of Dreams.
Yeah.
In your opinion, which actor played a more accurate depiction of Shoeless Joe, and which did you enjoy more?
I have to confess here, I read the book Eight Men Out, but I didn't see the film, so I can't make a good comparison there. I saw Field of Dreams many times. That's one of those ones that you see over and over. I mean, I saw it initially with my wife, and then I saw it with my son, then I saw it with my grandsons. But I never had the opportunity, or never took the opportunity, to see the other one, so I can't make a comparison. From everything I've heard, both of them did a pretty good job of representing him.
Nice.
All right. We always talk about Joe in the Hall of Fame and whatnot. Joe was actually on the ballot in 1936 and 1946. Yet almost no votes. And he got 2 votes each year, which is hard to believe from his
Yeah.
great career. Obviously, people were holding back the aspect that he was banned from baseball, but he has been on the ballot twice, which is kind of unique that he was on the ballot after he was banned from baseball, but obviously different rules maybe back then. What do you think it'll take now to get him off this restricted list and back on the ballot? And do you think he ever will be?
Well, I'll preface that with a couple of things that I often point out to people. He was banned from baseball for life in 1920, but the Hall of Fame wasn't even created until 1936. As you pointed out, the first year they held a ballot was 1936. And obviously, shoe-ins on the first ballot were guys like Ty Cobb and Babe Ruth. So there was still that sort of holdover of, thinking that he'd somehow been besmirched. So even though he was on the ballot that year, like you said, he only got a handful of votes, 2 or 3. But since that time, he was barred from the ballot for quite a while. I think that, first of all, you could argue that while he was banned from baseball, he was not banned from the Hall of Fame, because the Hall of Fame wasn't created until 16 years later. Although the Hall of Fame makes their own rules as to who gets on the veterans ballot, and a lot of that is influenced by this sort of knee-jerk carryover mentality that I mentioned. The other argument you could make is he was banned from baseball for life, and even if that includes the Hall of Fame, his life ended in 1951. So those are the two arguments that I give. I personally, I think that what might happen is that after Pete Rose dies, that maybe both of them will get put on the ballot and both of them will get elected in. I'm not saying that there's an equivalency there. Pete Rose admitted that he gambled on baseball, although he claimed that he only bet on his own team to win. And even if that's true, you're still associating yourself with and possibly ingratiating yourself to gamblers and that element of society. So I'm not saying that there's an equivalency there, but certainly both of them had numbers that were worthy of the Hall of Fame. And I kind of have the idea that maybe after Pete Rose dies, maybe both of them might get in. Don't know.
Just to build off of that real quick, do you think that whenever Commissioner Giamatti was looking at the Pete Rose situation, that he reflected on what had happened previously with Joe Jackson?
Yes, I do know that, and my recollection of it was that Bart Giamatti was reasonably sympathetic toward Joe Jackson, but obviously there wasn't any immediate result from that in terms of changing Joe's status with being on the veterans ballot. So a lot of it has to do with that, and I use the word knee jerk quite a bit. But from what I've heard, I moved to Greenville from Cleveland 10 years ago, and from what I've heard from locals, the team that we've got here now called the Greenville Drive, which is sort of a nod to the automotive industry around here. We've got a major BMW plant and a major Michelin tire plant and a lot of automotive suppliers. Plus, I think the guy that owns the club is from Michigan. But before that, they had a team here that was affiliated with the Braves, and they were, as some of you guys probably know, the Braves like most of their farm teams to be called the Braves rather than some name of local significance to the little town that the farm team was in. But there was a hiatus of quite a few years between the Greenville Braves and the new club that came in and known as the Greenville Drive. And several locals have told me that the original thought was to call the team the Greenville Joes, and that baseball establishment basically vetoed that, said, no, you can't do that. So, I mean, to me, that seems pretty petty, but it also seems to fit in with what I call the knee-jerk reaction to anything having to do with Joe Jackson by the establishment.
Right. So you told us a lot about some of the things in the museum. Tell us where the museum is at and how people can to donate to the museum.
Okay. The museum, like I said, is in a brick house that Joe and Katie had built for themselves in 1941. They lived in it. He died in it in 1951, and she died in 59. I don't think she died in the house, though. I think she died in the hospital. But the house was out by the Brandon Mill area, and it was about to get torn down to make way for something. And somebody that knew the significance of it, that former Major League superstar Joe Jackson had lived in it, said, we want to save that house. So there was a guy with a TV show, Flip That House or something like that, that said that he had the mechanism, the technical ability to move the house if only somebody would donate the space to place the house on. And this was back in like the early 2000s, I think, maybe 2006 7 or 8, that a real estate company on a block directly across the street from Fluor Field, which is the stadium that our local Class A team, the Greenville Drive affiliated with the Red Sox, plays in. A real estate company directly across the street from that stadium owned that whole block, and they said, "We'll take the house, put it here." So they put the house there, and the collection of the museum actually started out in our city hall, in the Greenville City Hall, because in the early '80s, when all these movies and books were coming out, and there was all this interest in Joe Jackson, people did a little bit of thumbnail research and found out, well, he was born in Greenville, South Carolina. They were calling the city hall in Greenville, South Carolina, wanting to know what you could tell them about Joe Jackson. And the mayor said, I don't know much about him. So he asked his assistant to find out what she could find out about getting a low battery notice here. The mayor asked his assistant, Arlene Markley, to do some research and, come up with something to be able to say about Joe Jackson when all these people called from all over the country wanting to know about Joe Jackson in Greenville. So she started talking to people locally to learn about Joe Jackson, and people started giving her stuff. So the nucleus of what became our museum collection started out as a display in the lobby of the Greenville City Hall under the direction of Ms. Arlene Markley. And eventually, when this story of the house getting moved that I just told you about got plunked at the end of the block, the collection got moved into the house, and we've continued to acquire things since then. So since that time, a new developer came in, and they built an apartment building right in the middle of the block, and they called the apartment building 408 Jackson. So there's that number 408 from his 1911 year. The address of our house is 356 Field Street. So when the new outfit came in to build the apartment building, they said, we like the idea of this. We're going to co-brand with the Joe Jackson sort of thing, but the house is kind of in our way. So they moved it a second time from the one end of the block to the other end of the block. So the house has been physically moved. It was taken apart the first time it was moved. It's been physically moved twice. So we had to take all the stuff down out of it when it got moved the second time. And then COVID came and we were closed for a while. We're a strictly volunteer operation. We're not a city or county or state museum. We get zero tax money at all. All the money, in fact, we used to be free just based on donations. We started charging an admission fee of $7 for adults. Veterans, active military, and children are free. We do take donations, obviously. We've got expenses. Nobody gets paid that work there. Everybody's a volunteer. But we have to, pay the light bill and the air conditioning and all of that kind of stuff. Certainly, we've got a website that shows you about donations. We also sell merch over the website, like the T-shirt that I'm wearing here, and various kinds of other things. So the museum is at 356 Field Street in Greenville, South Carolina. It's directly across the street from the Greenville Drive Stadium, which is a Class A affiliate of the Boston Red Sox. Interestingly enough, on the other side of that stadium, there's a statue of our favorite son, Joe Jackson, swinging a bat. And the base of that statue is actually made out of bricks from the old Comiskey Park in Chicago that Joe played in when they tore that down to build the new one, which has had 2 or 3 different names now due to different sponsorships, I think. The bricks from the old one got saved for souvenir purposes. And like I said, the base of the Joe Jackson statue in front of Fluor Field is made out of bricks from Comiskey Park. We've got a seat from old Comiskey Park and a couple of bricks on display in our museum. And also for real diehard White Sox fans, we've got a couple of those bricks for sale. I say real diehard because I don't know anybody else that wants to spend $200 or $300 on a brick. But if you're a diehard White Sox fan, I could understand it. So that's the story on our museum. We've got very restrictive hours right now because, like I said, we're not part of any larger museum complex. We've got all volunteers, and we're only open 4 hours a week. We're open from 10 to 2 on Saturdays, and that's pretty much it.
Okay. Thank you for joining us, Tom, and sharing all this info on Shoeless Joe.
Okay, well, I hope I didn't ramble on too much, and hopefully you guys will do a good job of editing it, and let me know when it comes on, and I'll have a look and see how it came out.
Will do. I'll remind everybody, hit that like, subscribe, notification button. We'll see you all next time. Everyone have a great night.